Welcome to another edition of TelescopeMan. You know, I thought a good little project for a podcast would be to just show some pictures of various types of equipment and then describe that equipment so that beginners can learn a little bit about the equipment, and when they see the name on a website or they're looking for a scope or a piece of equipment, it'll mean a little more to them if they've seen a picture of it and heard a description about it. So, with that said, I'm going to open up a little window here with quite a few pieces of equipment on it. And what we're going to do is go through these pictures and kind of describe some of this equipment to you, so that if you're in the market to buy a scope or a piece of equipment, or you may not know what that piece of equipment is used for, you'll have a little bit better idea about the equipment. So let's start out with probably what many beginners start with, and that's a small refractor on an alt-azimuth mount, like this one. Okay, a little Celestron 60 millimeter refractor. You know, I started out with one of these back in 1958, purchased from Sears Roebuck, made in Japan. The optics were very good, but the mount never was very good. And if you look at this mount that it's setting on, it's in what's called an altitude azimuth mount, and it's got a little rod on the side that supposedly helps you to slowly raise it and lower it in altitude. And of course the little fork on it rotates left and right. But what the problem with this mount is, it's usually setting on a very small, spindly type tripod like what you see there. And it's going to be kind of shaky. Every time you touch this, it's going to shake. The image will shake, especially if you're using high magnification. And the second problem with the scope is it's a 60 millimeter scope. Now keep in mind that many amateur astronomers use 50 millimeter binoculars. So this is not very much bigger than a pair of 50 millimeter binoculars. Yes, you can see objects in the sky with this scope, and it doesn't cost very much, but it's going to really limit you in what you can do in the amateur astronomy hobby. Now, if you don't have much money and this is all you can afford, well, go for it. But sooner or later, you're going to figure out for yourself that you're going to need a little more aperture than 60 millimeter, and that the mount that this tube is attached to has so many problems with it that really you can make it better, but you'll never make it fully acceptable for amateur astronomy and for a stable platform to look at objects in the sky. So many of these are sold. You'll see these all over Craigslist for sale, you know, sometimes for $25 or $30. But really, you need to think about that before you run out there and buy one of these, and spend just a little bit more money and get something that might be a little more acceptable to you. So let's look at some different styles of this same tube so you kind of get an idea of what's out there if you're looking around and you see a scope like this one. This one, of course, it was called the Celestron 60 millimeter Power Master. Okay, strange name for a very small aperture scope, Power Master. All right, let's look at another one that's very similar to it, and one that many beginners buy because it just looks scientific, and they think that that means it's an outstanding scope because it looks scientific. So let's open this up. This is a Celestron 70 millimeter EQ equatorially mounted Power Master. Okay, so here it is. And, not too bad of a scope for your first scope. Again, it's not going to be very expensive to buy this. But I want to draw your attention to the EQ1. That's what that is. That's an equatorial 1 mount. Notice how small the tripod legs are, how small the head of the equatorial mount is. It's going to be tough to move around accurately. It's going to be somewhat tough to polar align this scope. Every equatorial mount has to be polar aligned before you can actually use it properly. So I see a lot of beginners buying a scope like this, and again, it's not very expensive, but the tube on it might be very satisfactory optics-wise, 70 millimeter, and it probably has pretty good views through it, but it's setting on, again, a rickety mount that will shake, etc., when you try to, if you accidentally even try to touch it, the image is going to shake for a period of time before it settles down. And again, the equatorial mount is really substandard to accurately hold the tube that's mounted on it. That's going to become evident to you as I show you some more pictures here in a minute. This is just another scope that we see beginners buying. Don't be fooled by this, what looks like real scientific. It's got a dial on it, with some numbers on it, etc. Don't be fooled by that. Look at the amount, how substantial all this mechanism is when you're deciding on an equatorial mount. And the smallest equatorial mount I would suggest that you would buy ever is what's called an EQ5. And again, this is an EQ1 or maybe an EQ2. EQ5 would be the smallest one that I would suggest that you ever buy. An EQ5 can serve you quite well in the astronomy hobby. So let's continue on here with another one. Okay, so let's move on to another very similar scope to the one I just showed you on that equatorial mount, and that would be this Celestron 70 millimeter Power Master on an alt azimuth mount. And actually, if I had to recommend one of these to you, now this is the third little refractor that I've showed you. Remember, I started off with that fork-mounted little alt-az refractor, and then I showed you an EQ-mounted refractor, and now I'm showing you an altitude azimuth refractor on what I think is probably the lowest cost, most usable, small refractor for a beginning amateur astronomer. Another Celestron product. The reviews I've seen on this all say that the movements of the mount are very nice and smooth, and you can control this scope. Now, it has no motors or anything. You're going to have to point it directly at the object that you want to look at. But then once you have that object in the eyepiece, you can, by adjusting the two bolts on this particular mount, two of them, you can get a kind of a smooth movement out of this scope so that you can manually track that object in the sky. So if I was going to recommend a very low cost scope to someone, it would be this 70 millimeter Celestron on this particular altitude azimuth mount. So you might want to make note of this one. And again, it's Celestron 70 millimeter Astromaster. So you can go to the Celestron.com site and probably get some information on this particular Celestron scope. Now, let's kind of show you some other ones that I would recommend to you. And for my first one, if we'll look up here, this is a 200 millimeter reflector, except it happens to be on a EQ5 mount. This is an EQ5 mount. It's about an 8-inch reflector on this mount. Looks like a Skywatcher brand, which is a good brand. And appears to be a Skywatcher EQ5 mount. Can't tell if it has motors on it or not. Looks like it might have at least one motor on it, maybe. Anyway, these are available. These mounts right here are available with and without motors. So depending on your price point, you could buy one of these with slow motion knobs on the right ascension and declination axis. Okay, so here is the right ascension axis and here is the declination axis. Okay, and here we go. And this particular axis must be pointed directly at the star Polaris for visual observing. That's really all you need to do is get Polaris in this polar scope right here. You sit back here and look through here, and there's a little telescope in here, a little finder scope with some reticle markings on it, and you get Polaris in there and you are close enough for visual observing. That's all you need to do. For astrophotography now, you're going to have to more closely align this on the North Celestial Pole, which is about 3/4 of a degree away from Polaris. And there's some markings inside this little polar scope right here that help you locate the actual celestial pole. You're going to have to do that if you want to take pictures with this scope. You're going to have to be more accurately aligned than if you just wanted to do visual observing. So here you go. This is kind of my basic recommendation for someone that hasn't decided if they want to be a visual observer or an astrophotographer. You can use this scope and mount right here for both of those. You can just use it visually, and or you can try your hand at some basic astrophotography. Now again, I said this tube was about an 8-inch. You know, I would probably recommend that you go with a 6-inch reflector as your first tube on top of this EQ5 mount. You're going to have a little bit better chance at accurately tracking the sky if you can kind of lower the weight that's hung out here on this equatorial mount and get it down below its maximum weight carrying capacity. If you want to know what that is, you can look this mount up on Skywatcher or Celestron or other places that sell an EQ5 type mount, and it will give you the weight carrying capacity of this mount. And for astrophotography, you really want to stay under about 70% of its maximum weight carrying capacity. You don't want to have it up there at 100% of its weight carrying capacity. Also remember, the counterweights don't count. You don't count the weight of the counterweights. You count the weight of everything you have mounted up here on the top, cameras, maybe another scope as a guide scope to go along with this scope. Whatever you have mounted up here is your weight. You don't take into consideration the counterweights. So this would be, again, my basic recommendation for a mount and tube that could be used quite well for both visual and for basic astrophotography. Again, an EQ5 mount. Notice how much more substantial this mount is than that little bitty Celestron refractor EQ1 or EQ2, whatever it is, that I showed you a few minutes ago. Okay, so we've looked at basically some alt-az mounts and some little equatorial mounts and some better equatorial mounts. So let's look at a really good mount just to give you an idea of what I consider to be one of the best mid-priced mounts for astrophotography, and that would be an EQ6. This happens to be an Atlas EQG, which is an EQ6 mount. Skywatcher has the exact same mount in white. It is identical to this one, and just a different name on the outside and different paint job. So either the Skywatcher white version of this or the Atlas EQG, they're identical. And they are EQ6 mounts. Very capable mounts for astrophotography. Now you're going to pay $1,200, $1,300 US for this, but in a minute I'm going to show you some other EQ mounts, and you're going to think this is a real deal when I get finished with those other mounts. But this will work quite well for astrophotography or for visual. But if you're planning to get into astrophotography, you really need to jump up to something like an EQ6, either the Atlas or the Skywatcher EQ6 mount. Then you go out and find the tube that you want to stick on top of this mount. So let's talk about that for a minute. So I've gone out and bought myself one of these EQ6 mounts. Now I've got to figure out what to put on top. And probably the first thing we tell folks to put on top is something like a small refractor. This happens to be a 90 millimeter Stellarvue Raptor triplet refractor. Now this is going to be kind of an expensive scope right here, but this would be what we would recommend to put on top of that Atlas mount or that Skywatcher EQ6 mount, something like this. Now you can find one that's a doublet instead of a triplet, and if it's made with extra low dispersion glass, usually indicated by ED in the description. So it might say something like 80 millimeter ED. Okay, well, it's going to have better color correction than a non-ED type scope. So you can find you one of those. Orion makes one that's around about $500. That's a very good beginner refractor. Now The thing you need to know is you do not need big apertures to do excellent astrophotography. Most of your really famous astrophotographers are using a refractor somewhere between 80 millimeter and 120 millimeter. Somewhere in between there. That's what they're using. Of course, they're using the expensive refractors that are triplet lenses, and they can get up there quite expensive, but for a beginner, you can find yourself a doublet lens type for under $500, and that's what I would probably recommend that you mount on top of that Atlas mount or that Skywatcher EQ6. Now, another type of scope that I would recommend is the Astrotech RC type scopes. They come in various sizes. The bigger they are, the more expensive they are. But these have virtually flat fields and are, in other words, the stars are pinpoints all the way out to the edge of the field of view. And these are excellent scopes for astrophotography. So look up Astrotech RC6 or RC8 or RC10 and start looking at those. They all come with what's called a dovetail mount. Already on the bottom, you can't quite see it right here, but it's right under here is a dovetail mount. There's the front of it right there. And that mount basically slips into a saddle that you can see the dovetail here. They've got it mounted on the saddle, see it? But that scope already has this piece on it, and it just simply slips into the head and locks down, and you've mounted that scope onto your mount. So kind of neat. It comes with that accessory already. So look up this particular scope right here on the internet, which is called an Astrotech, T-E-C-H, Astrotech RC. This one happens to be a 6, but they do make other sizes, so one of those may pop up. This is another good one if you want to do astrophotography. Highly recommended. Now, let's suppose you're just a plain old visual observer and you could care less about astrophotography, etc., etc. So let me show you what I think are some of the best scopes to look at for just simply visual, okay? You could jump out there and look at the Orion Star Blaster 4.5-inch reflector. And what the neat thing about this is there's a little bolt underneath here, and you can mount this onto a tripod if you want to, but it's meant to go on top of a table. And you can basically carry this out in one hand, set it on a table, and you have left-right motion and up-down motion. Okay, and so you just simply use this red dot finder that you've lined up already with the main tube. Got to do that before you can use it. Got to line up the red dot that's in this little device right here with the exact position that this scope is pointed at, and then you can use this red dot and point this scope at objects in the sky. All right. Very nice little, not too expensive, several $100s, a couple of $100 if memory serves me right. Orion Star Blaster reflector on a Dobsonian mount. That's what that is. The mount is called a Dobsonian mount. So that'd be one of my recommendations. Or possibly just a regular full-size, what we call a Dobsonian scope. Now this is just another reflector, You know, it's got a mirror back here, got a little mirror up here. All right, here's the focuser. There's the little red dot finder. Again, it's on a Dobsonian base. This happens to be a 6-inch Orion Dob, and would make an excellent beginner's telescope. You know, this one would be an excellent beginners. You can pick this thing up with one hand and carry it outside. They do have other sizes. The sizes refer to the size of the mirror. So you might see a 4.5-inch Dob or a 6-inch Dob like this one, or an 8-inch or a 10-inch or whatever. And that refers to the size of this mirror right here. So let's continue on with our little Dob discussions, because what I see people doing is this right here. Okay, here's another little reflector. Looks like it's, can't really tell. It might be 3.5 inches, might be 4.5 inches. I can't tell. But again, I caution you, look at what it's mounted on. A very spindly EQ mount, all right? It's either an EQ1 or an EQ2, can't tell. But this is going to be shaky, folks. You're going to be kind of frustrated with this. Remember, you're going to have to polar align this axis, at least with Polaris, all right? So you're going to have to point this so that Polaris is visible in this eyepiece, and then you can use the scope as it was meant to be used, all right? So I see a lot of people buying this, and I still say I think they buy it because it looks scientific, all right? This tube is exactly identical to those Dobbs that I showed you before. You see this tube right here? It's exactly the same kind of tube, exactly the same kind of optics, just on a different type of mount, okay? So don't let this mount kind of fool you, all right? Use some of these. Go to a star party. Walk around the field. Somebody's going to have one of these on the field. Somebody's going to have a Dob on the field. Ask their permission if you can just manipulate the controls on these, and ask them how you polar align these types of mounts. And then you make your own decision on the type of mount that you want to go with as your first scope. I want to show you another little piece of equipment that you may hear about or see about, and that's a dual speed focuser. So some of the focusers that you'll see are just single speed focusers, but here's what a dual speed focuser looks like. The inner knob is rough focusing. It moves this section here kind of quick, and the outer knob is for fine tuning, and it moves this very, very slow. So it helps you to get accurate focusing easier on an object that has a lot of magnification on it. So when you hear about a 2-speed focuser, this is what they're talking about. It's actually a dual speed that helps you focus at high magnifications. Okay, so that's a dual speed focuser. Let me show you another scope that I think is a great buy for beginners, and that is the Skywatcher Heritage 130p right here. Again, it looks kind of like that Orion Star Blaster, you remember? Let me go back to that and show you that. Remember this scope? Again, that's a highly recommended scope. We would recommend this to a beginner. Sort of looks like that, except it's on a truss basis where you can slide this back into the scope, and it stores like this in very little space, okay? You can pick this up with this little carrying handle right here and walk outside with it. No problem. And then you telescope out the secondary and the focuser and the red dot. They telescope out, and then you're ready to view. So very neat scope, very low cost. Now, unfortunately, this particular scope is not available in the USA. I just can't believe they haven't brought this scope to the USA. This is probably, if somebody said, I need a scope that's not very expensive and I want to find out if I like the hobby and I don't want to spend a lot of money, this is the one that I would tell them to run out and buy. This one right here. It's 130 millimeter, so it's got pretty good light grasp and aperture. And all the reports I've seen on this scope say it has good motion in the little knob base that it has. Got good motion and very neat little tool to use for your astronomy hobby. So if you're anywhere but the USA, I want you to look up the Skywatcher Heritage 130p. That's this little scope right here. A very neat scope. Now let's jump into some fully go-to scopes. Some of the beginners, I want a go-to scope. Okay, so let me give you a few recommendations. One of my first ones would be the Celestron 4SE little scope, which is this scope right here. This is a Maksutov designed tube. That's a type of telescope. It's got a long focal length, which means that it's good for planets, good for solar, good for splitting double stars. But it does have a narrow field of view. So for a beginner, I would say this could really get you going in the right direction if you've just got to have a go-to scope with a computer hand controller. I would definitely look at the Celestron 4SE, which is this one. And if you want to spend just a little bit more, you can jump out there and look at the Celestron 8SE. There's also a 6SE. It's kind of in between these. Now notice this lens up here. This is not a Maksutov style telescope. This is a regular Schmidt-Cassegrain tube. I believe it's an f10, and not too slow, not too fast, kind of in the middle. And my LX90 8-inch is virtually identical to this tube right here. It's going to give you very good views. It's 8 inches of aperture. It's not going to be quite as portable as that little 4-inch or the 6-inch that they also make. But if you want to get yourself a go-to scope, I would highly recommend this Celestron 8SE as your first go-to scope. In that same vein, I would also recommend the LX90 Meade 8-inch. That's what this one is. I own one of these and have for several years. And again, a little bit higher price than the single-armed Celestron. Now let me jump you back and show you that. The Celestron is mounted on one fork arm. The Meade is mounted on a double fork arm, okay? A little bit more stable design. However, the Celestron, I've never heard bad reports about the single-armed fork. Okay, never have heard any bad reports about that. So here's another scope if you want to look at one that's very good for visual. Very good for visual. Would not buy this scope for astrophotography. I would buy a Atlas EQG or a Skywatcher EQ6, and I would put a refractor on it if I wanted to do astrophotography, or I'd put that Astrotech 8-inch 8RC on top of it. All right, gonna be very similar priced to this. Be very similar. You won't be very much within a couple of $100. That rig I showed you earlier, which is this mount, okay, and this RC scope, Astrotech, you can probably put together one of those rigs for a couple of $1,000s, and that's what you're going to pay for this LX90. All right, so that's why we say you need to kind of make the decision which way you want to go. Do you want to go for astrophotography, or do you want to go for visual? It's kind of a major decision. You know, you can go for both if you have the money. But I own this scope. I use it very frequently for public observing. It's never failed me. It finds objects. You know, it'll find Saturn in the daytime or Venus in the daytime. And go-tos are very, very good if you train them. All these go-to scopes have to be trained and calibrated, and there's a routine that you have to go through to calibrate the motors, train the motors, calibrate the sensors. So there's a learning curve with all these. Another good one is the Celestron CPC 8-inch, and that's their offering right there. Kind of competes with the LX90 that I showed you a minute ago. Similar price. It really comes down to which hand controller you prefer, because the views and the go-tos are going to be very similar in either this scope or the LX90. Will be very similar views. You know, very similar operation except for the hand controllers. So if you're in the market to buy a $2,000 go-to scope, I would go look at the CPC version, play with it, play with the hand controller, see what you think, and then I would go look at the LX90 and do the same thing and see which hand controller you prefer. Now, if you want to use a fork mount, which has problems when you're talking about astrophotography, however, many people take very good pictures with these mounts. All right, so they take very good pictures mounted altitude azimuth, which is what this is mounted. This is altitude azimuth. You know, it turns left and right, and this moves up and down. Of course, it's got motors that do that. So they do take good pictures, short exposures, stacked with these type of telescopes. Here's their 200, LX200 version right here. Little more substantial fork mount. Also, the control panel here has a lot more ports, etc. on it than the LX90 does right out of the box. And so a lot of people use the LX200 for astrophotography use and for visual. However, what you really need to buy if you're going to do that is a device called a wedge. Okay? This is a wedge, and what you do is you mount this to the tripod and you mount the telescope to the pad that you see here, and then you tilt this pad so that the forks are pointed at the north celestial pole. So you basically polar align what was an alt-az scope right here by tilting this whole mechanism. That wedge would be down here, and this would be pointed toward the celestial pole, okay, not just straight up and down. These forks would be pointed toward Polaris and the North Celestial Pole. Then you can do longer term astrophotography using what's called a wedge. And of course, you know, you've just added a whole bunch of weight and a whole bunch of more takedown setup time to what, in my opinion, are very good visual scopes, this is a very good visual scope, all right? It's not so good for astrophotography. Same goes for the LX90. Very good visual scope. Not so good for astrophotography, but you can do it with this scope. Also, the LX200 would not be my first choice for an astrophotography rig. And there's a lot of flexure in this mount, okay, that you won't notice visually, but your camera will notice it. And you're going to be chasing down gremlins in your images that are caused totally by this fork mount, okay? And the only way to eliminate that is to shorten your exposures and hopefully be able to gather some data that you can use and generate good astrophotographers, astrophotography. But this used to be the premier way to do astrophotography. If I went back about 10 years or so, you know, everybody was using one of these, and everybody was using one of these, and they just came out with better equipment during the last 10 years for astrophotographers. The German equatorial mounts have gotten much better. The go-to systems have gotten much better, and now most astro imagers have switched to a German equatorial type mount to take astrophotos with. So again, good visual scope right here, good visual scope, not so good for astrophotography, but you can do it. And excellent mount for astrophotography. Very good mount. Remember the EQ5 over here. This is a Skywatcher mount right here. This EQ5 mount right here. Pretty good for astrophotography, but I would suggest you at least get a right ascension motor for it, okay, when you buy an EQ5. All right, so let's keep on going. I want to show you a few other pieces of equipment. Recently, Skywatcher has come out with a telescopic type Dob. Seen several of these. These are available in the States and in Europe. These are very nice scopes that collapse down into very usable, small, portable parts. So this entire mechanism will slide down, okay, and you can remove these tubes. You can remove this. This head comes off. You store these tubes. The base is separate. So you can put this in any car you can figure out. And then, of course, the base is right here by itself. So the tube breaks down into several parts. And very neat scope by Skywatcher. Again, it's a Dob. It's a Dob style scope. The only thing I would tell you is that it's called a truss type Dob because it's got these little posts on it holding up the secondary. What I would tell you is that a truss type Dob is not really needed in scopes that are 10 inches and smaller. then you should go with a straight tube Dob that, just one straight tube. And it's much easier to manipulate than this truss Dob and set up. It's quicker to set up, etc. Collimation will probably stay a little better in a straight tube Dob than in this truss configuration. But if you're considering a 12-inch or 14-inch Dob, this is the way to go. Because then you can break down these parts and store them, carry them around a little bit easier, and store them in a car for transport. So my break point is 12 inches. Anything 12 inches or bigger needs to be a truss type Dob, and anything smaller than that needs to be a straight tube. That's just my opinion. Okay, continuing on, I want to show you some, you've been in the hobby for a while, you know how to astro image, and I want to show you just finally a couple of pieces of equipment that, everybody wishes they had. Okay, so for an EQ mount, the wish list consists of a astrophysics type mount, astrophysics brand type mount. Here you go with one right here, and of course the Paramount ME, which is right here. Now you're going to pay something like $13,000 for these type of mounts. Okay, so you're going to have to be in the hobby big time in order to justify that kind of expense. But these two mounts are considered to be two of the best equatorial mounts available in the market. These two. Astrophysics brand, you can Google that and you'll go right to their site, or a Paramount ME by Bisque Software. Just Google Paramount ME and you'll go right to their site. And then, of course, finally, the other piece of equipment that everybody lusts over is a Takahashi telescope and mount. And this is the EM200 mount. And this looks like a 120 millimeter Takahashi refractor sitting on this EM200 mount. These are excellent for both visual and astrophotography. You're looking at one of the premier setups in the entire hobby right now, this particular setup of scope and mount. And basically these are handmade in Japan, literally. The metal is even cast. This metal is cast by hand in the factory there, cast by hand, okay? And the scopes are all hand-built scopes. So excellent for astrophotography, excellent for visual. You're going to have pinpoint stars. This go-to is going to be very accurate in this EM200 mount. But again, you're looking at $12,000, $10,000, $12,000 for the mount, and probably another $6,000, $7,000 for the tube. All right, so very expensive. So with that, finishing up with what we all wish we could have, I hope this little equipment review has been worthwhile to you. I hope you learned something. And I'm going to throw up another EQ mount. We can't leave here until we show at least the Los Mandy G11 with the Gemini go-to system on it. And I would put that almost in the same league with those astrophysics and Paramount Me scopes. Not quite there, but almost. And Here's an image of the Los Mandy G11 EQ mount and the Gemini Go-To system. This is an excellent mount that's right up there with everybody lusting after buying it. And again, you're going to pay a lot of money for this mount if that's what you want. So until next time, I wish y'all clear skies. And remember to keep looking up to see the greatest show on earth right over your head every single night. See y'all later.